America is supplying hired guns in the Middle East. Mercenaries from the private US military firm Dincor recently arrived in the Yemeni city of Aden, where UAE forces are fighting against the Yemeni army and popular committees on Saudi orders. An official source from the Yemeni Defense Ministry confirmed mercenaries from Dincor International have been active there. The agency reports that mercenaries and naval forces recently arrived in the port city of Aden to replace those of American firm Blackwater, now renamed Academy, which also sends mercenaries to foreign countries on paid missions. Blackwater withdrew from Bab el-Mandeb region after the Yemeni forces inflicted heavy losses on them. The UAE was forced to bring in the new mercenaries from Dincor for the same reason. Meanwhile, Yemen itself has suffered over 8,400 deaths and twice that number injured since the fighting began in March 2015. Hospitals, schools and factories have also been damaged and destroyed. Why is the US helping Saudi Arabia kill civilians in Yemen? Why is America training and supplying mercenaries? And what if Yemenis retaliate? These are the simple and pressing questions we sought to answer. Now, Saudi Arabia has killed well over 8,000 Yemenis since March 2015, many of them young children. How should the US be punished for supporting Saudi Arabia's massacre? That's what we put to the American public.
One event can't define the whole crisis. So you would have to go back and look at everything that's occurred over time.
Who in the world would kill children, and why would that be, justified? So that's why would we come to that assumption that U.S. supports, the killing of children, innocent children?
I think they first should change their policies, for sure. And I would hope that this would also be brought to the United Nations, and they should take their responsibility as world citizens in this, yeah.
Well, who's going to do the punishing? I mean, who can punish them? There's nobody is available to do that.
I think they should be maybe questioned as to why they did it. I don't know what punishment they deserve, really.
Well, I don't know that that's actually correct, so I really can't comment.
They should be under pressure from the international community, and it should be called in the United Nations.
Our experts considered a proportionate punishment against Saudi Arabia's ally, the US, in the context of these thousands of adult and child deaths.
Well, America is a superpower, and regrettably America is a very dangerous, irresponsible superpower, so there's very little ways that America can be punished for such heinous crimes. However, one of them in this day and age is, of course, PR, and America does care about how countries in the world, how peoples in the world perceive it. So in the advent of the internet, of social media, of new news channels like PressTV, we can really expose America's double standards. We can really expose America's crimes on the international stage. And I think that is just as powerful as sanctions, because the Americans, they rely on this image which they project to the world of being a guardian of democracy and of human rights. And unfortunately, 20 years ago, it was very difficult to challenge that because mainstream media ruled the field. But now in 2016, we have news channels like PressTV, we have different social media outlets, and we can accumulate evidence, we can make intelligent, persuasive arguments, and we can highlight what America is doing in Yemen, what America is doing in Libya, what America is doing in Syria, and we can really hit them hard that way. And the Americans are feeling the effects of their double standards in the world today.
Out of the present world chaos, a new world order is developing. It will be multipolar and not the present unipolar, which is totally dominated by the USA. And that then tells us something, is that punishment, and I will give its form, must be aimed at the USA and its axis of equal partners, which is in fact Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that punishment can only be a wholesale boycott, divest, political, economic, diplomatic, and yes, even militarily. Because you see, we are going along with this axis of evil and its monstrous aggressions. And the same with where I am at this moment, which is the UK. The UK, like the USA, is not following its long-term interests. It should break away from Saudi Arabia, break away from the USA, stand up and be counted, because the world is moving in favour of the multipolar way and away from American domination and its evil association with Israel and Saudi Arabia.
As we've noted, militants from one private US military firm are replacing militants from another American company. Why is the US helping Saudi Arabia kill civilians in Yemen? Can the public explain it?
Again, that part of the world is rather complex and has been that way for easily over 2 decades. So I would say that there's no doubt we're involved in things that you may agree with, may disagree with, but if you give us like 3 years, probably you and I are going to be on the same sheet of music with what's taking place in that part of the country.
I don't know about this issue, but this is probably something that the U.S. is not taught truly, but anything that against the human rights that does, it's against the United States interest all over the world. So U.S. must always do the right thing, even though it's not in the interest in the short term.
To assume that any sovereign nation is killing children, again, there has to be much more behind that, because I don't know of a nation in the world that is excited about, hey, we go kill children, so that there's much more behind that. 1, 2, an organization, you refer to an organization as a militia. Okay, that means that you don't agree with the mission of that organization. Many Americans have weird feelings about capitalistic organizations that go to other parts of the world and make money to do their dirty work. There's a segment of America that is really hyped on capitalism at any cost. But there are others of us that have, morals that no, money should not be made at any cost.
I don't know, but that sounds pretty awful to me, and I don't really approve of privately paid contractual militants or militias, which I realize are all over the place, but I find it offensive.
I know about the conflict, but I don't know enough to actually give you good answers. I'm sorry.
Well, I guess they value their relationship with Saudi Arabia more than they value their relationship with Yemen. But I thought the United States had a good relationship with Yemen, at least up to for a while they did. It's probably less good than what used to be.
Is there a logical reason behind America's willingness to supply militants to Saudi Arabia for their deadly activities in Yemen? Here's the expert view.
Well, first of all, Saudi Arabia is one of America's closest friends and allies in the world. And of course, the Arabian Peninsula is of immense geostrategic importance, hence why the Americans have an influence there. It's where the oil is. And it is not in the interests for America to see Saudi Arabian clout, Saudi Arabian dominance on the Arabian Peninsula challenged. So if we go back to 2011, when the so-called, and I emphasize the so-called Arab Spring began, there were protests, peaceful protests in Bahrain. What happened? Saudi Arabia saw that as a threat to its dominance on the Arabian Peninsula. The Americans, without a doubt, gave them the go-ahead, and Saudi Arabia dispatched troops across the border into Bahrain and brutally suppressed the protests. There was no condemnation of that in the world by the West. There was no talk about that in the world by the West. But that just shows that if there's any threat to Saudi Arabian dominance on the Arabian Peninsula, the Americans will be there to give the green light to Saudi Arabia. Now in Yemen, the Houthis traditionally have close ties with Iran. There's nothing wrong with that. That's their relationship. But also something a lot of people aren't aware of, the Houthis have historical ties to Russia. Now, therein lies the answer as to why the Americans are concerned about what's happening in Yemen and is giving the green light to Saudi Arabia to act in such a brutal way.
There is this axis of evil. Now, its core purpose is in fact the Zionist purpose, to not only to maintain Israel, but in fact to expand Israel into what were the biblical lands over 2,000 years ago. Saudi Arabia is central to tolerating and discreetly allowing that expansion to go on. In exchange, the USA and Israel support the corrupt, barbarous Wahhabi Saudi regime to suppress the democratic aspirations of its own population. And that is the core of the matter. Of course, it goes even wider than that. The USA has a continuous record over decades of suppressing democratic forces right the way around the world, for example, in South America. But in this particular one, the USA is locked in with Saudi Arabia in an onslaught, a murderous onslaught in Yemen. The USA is locked in with Saudi Arabia on the creation and the promotion and the perpetration of Daesh, which is not only killing Syrians, but is going to smash Europe with its consequences. And the USA is locked in to the creeping genocide which is going on in Palestine. So there you have it altogether. It's an axis of evil. The USA is right in at the centre of that, and I'm ashamed to say that my government too is supporting them.
The contract between the United Arab Emirates and the US company is worth $3 billion US. How do the public feel about the way America is making money by supplying militants?
Yeah, I think that financially it's probably financially motivated. So it's probably not a good thing if they consider that the reason to do something.
I feel like sometimes we put money in ahead of like morals.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, you can make money. You can make money. Unless you're not hurting anybody, you know. You can make money off of it.
Well, that one I can't answer. I think we could do a much better and smarter job about making money, and generally we need to change the way that we're doing business in our own country and around the world.
What is the feeling of our experts about America's willingness to profit through the supply of trained killers to the United Arab Emirates?
Well, it's no surprise. No serious commentator would really argue that the United States is genuinely committed to international law, to human rights and democracy. It's an untenable argument, and I personally don't believe that officials, for example, in the Pentagon or in the State Department, truly believe that they are committed to human rights. So once again, what we're seeing in Yemen is just another example whereby the Americans will pursue extremely selfish geostrategic objectives, and part of those geostrategic objectives involves accumulating money for various private military companies. And of course these private military companies, they're not independent of the Pentagon, they're staffed by former Pentagon generals, and of course those private military companies are very much part of the American political establishment, and they're a lethal tool of American foreign policy makers.
US company Dincor, a rival of Blackwater, hires mercenaries to fight in foreign countries on paid missions. How surprised would you be if some Yemenis retaliate by targeting the US? That's what you asked the public.
I would be most unhappy, but my limited understanding and knowledge of Blackwater is not positive, and I really don't understand how they get away with their support.
I wouldn't be surprised at all. I wouldn't be surprised, and they will kick back at some stage.
I wouldn't be surprised at all. Like, no. Because I feel like I was told if someone hurts you, you got to hurt them back, so like an eye for an eye.
I probably wouldn't be very surprised, though I have not heard about that company before.
Yeah, unfortunately, these attacks are harming our country, United States. So when we do things like that, we should be more careful, because the best thing to terminate violence is to be consistent and protect the human rights all over the world consistently.
How likely is it that some Yemenis will target America in response to the supply by American firms of paid militants in Yemen? Our experts gave their assessment.
Well, unfortunately, violence breeds violence, action, reaction. And, I would like to think that if my family was wiped out by a Saudi Arabian airstrike with missiles provided by America, that I wouldn't respond in a violent way. I'd like to think that, but unfortunately, I've never experienced that before. And so, of course, there's the distinct possibility that some Yemenis people could respond violently to American interests in the world, maybe even a terrorist attack in America. That would be a terrible development, but unfortunately, violence breeds violence, and the Americans are at the root of most of the problems in the world today. And it's a reflection of human nature, animal nature. If you use violence, violence will be responded to yourself. So I would hope there wouldn't be any terrorist attacks in America, but unfortunately, if there is, then the American public will have to ask their government, what have they been doing in Yemen? Like on 9/11, appalling terrorist attacks. But what were the roots of that? The roots of that was American involvement in various countries in the world, and also they'd been working with Islamist terrorists since the 1980s in Afghanistan against the Russians when they teamed up with the Mujahideen, including bin Laden. If you play with fire, you get burned.
It is the assumption of Western governments and their acolytes, the mainstream media, that Western countries have a right not just to bully and harass, but to attack other countries and always to push up against them. For example, there was an agreement that NATO would not expand. That agreement was broken and NATO's gone right up against Russia. And one thinks of the attack by Georgia against South Ossetia, with the mainstream media telling the opposite of what was actually the truth. And you see the same sort of game going on in East Ukraine, where people were going to lose their lives. And when the Russians, following a vote, came to defend them, the Western media attacked Russia. You're also seeing the same game going on in the South China Sea. China has every reason to keep the sea lanes open. It relies on actually the export of all these container ships. There's no way that it will shut down those sea lanes. But of course, the Americans are push. So that's the overall background, that the West can attack, Israel can attack, Saudi Arabia can attack, America can attack. They can all go and attack anybody, and if anybody dares just to defend themselves. And I take one more example, Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is simply a local defensive force, end of subject. But then because it stands up in defence of Lebanon, it is called terrorist. I've had enough of this. The aggressors are the USA, my country, Saudi Arabia, in Israel. And if there is any retaliation, it's inevitable. When is the USA and the UK going to realise that their foreign policy makes them hated right the way throughout the world, and the world is changing?
Yemen has been under military attacks by Saudi Arabia for around a year now. How do the public explain the US's support for Arab dictatorships?
Again, a complex part of the world. One day there is a leader there that is the lesser of two evils, and that personality can change from year to year.
The United States supports dictatorships of any kind. I think that our leaders, particularly President Obama and other thoughtful leaders like himself, I think that thoughtful leaders over the world are able to assess, a situation and choose the lesser of two, evils. I personally don't think that Saddam Hussein was a great person. I don't think that Gaddafi was a great person. However, I do believe that they provided a great deal of stability to that component of the world.
How do you explain the U.S. support for dictatorships everywhere else in South America? I don't explain it.
I don't support Arab dictatorships, but on the other hand, the Arabs know how to run their countries better than the US do from here, and countries should be allowed to run and rule as they have done for many, many years, and interference by the US, by the British, by Western nations is totally wrong.
Well, I'm not really that familiar with the politics surrounding it, but I would say that they probably are doing it out of an agreement with them so that they'll support them in something that we want to do.
I feel like it's more of like a business contract sometimes and not more of like a moral thing, like we should and shouldn't do this. It's more like it's helping us make money and it's helping us do that kind of stuff.
I don't want to give you the answer I gave for the first two, so I'd say that the enemy you know or the problem you know is better than the problem you don't. It's safer to deal with people that are already set up than to try and change things around just willy-nilly.
Can our experts help us to understand the US's apparent enthusiasm for backing Arab dictatorships?
Simple as this. Those Arab dictatorships are pro-American, and for the Americans, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if they commit terrible human rights abuses. It doesn't matter if they export Islamism. It doesn't matter if they export terrorism. The most important thing for the Americans is that they are pro-Western, and that's all that really counts. And of course, America, geographically, if it was closer to Europe, they might be a bit more concerned about terrorism, but they're so far away, they don't worry about the short-term, reckless foreign policy objectives that they pursue in the world. So, in essence, those Arab dictatorships are pro-Western, they're anti-Iranian, they're anti-Russian, and for American policymakers, that's all that matters to them.
It's ultimately because of the nature of the global financial system. It's a system which now works by sucking up wealth to the tiny 1%. And as part of that, one of its outposts is Israel, and another one which is part of it is Saudi Arabia. And by the way, Islamic finance is only another version of the Western global financial system. And that's ultimately what lies behind, is that the Western global, which is essentially global financial system, is in fact a structure which not only supports the American dollar and enables it to finance its military expansion forevermore, but those who go along with it are kept up and supported. But this system is profoundly failing. You see, it does not actually distribute productive capacity amongst the mass of the population. If you want to have a democracy, you have to have an economic democracy in which the mass of ordinary people have productive capacity. That normally means a job, or it can mean small business, or it can mean share ownership. These are the ways it's done. But America has none of that.
Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners are clearly disregarding global standards of human rights and the sovereignty of nations. American firms are helping them do so by supplying weapons and militants into the war zone, as well as helping to destabilize an entire region of the Middle East. The actions of these US companies raise the specter of retaliation, and what form that could take is anyone's guess.